All right, today we're going to talk about U.S. economic warfare against Latin America in some specific places, at least in the early 1900s, from roughly 1903 to 1930. We're especially going to talk about Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and then how the U.S. would try to run economic warfare, not just against Latin America, but basically try to use its economic clout, its power of money, basically, to run really the rest of the world in the 1920s in the aftermath of World War I. But first we'll focus on Venezuela in the very early 1900s. So with this map, Venezuela is down in the northern coastline of South America. One thing to remember about U.S. foreign policy around the turn of the century, around the year 1900, is that it's largely focused on building a canal somewhere in Central America so that the U.S. would be able to move its ships from one ocean to the other without having to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. And the U.S. was so worried about being able to control that canal that they eventually built in Panama that U.S. foreign policy grew in scope to develop the goal of trying to control not just Panama, but large portions of Central America in order to protect access to the canal from further away, and would later even grow to an attempt, or at least a consideration, to try to dominate the entire Caribbean area, which would include Panama, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and one of the long-term keys to controlling the Caribbean Sea and access to the Caribbean Sea is to control Venezuela. So that was a long-term imperial strategy that the Spanish had used going back hundreds of years. And the United States will start to copy that strategy for largely the same reasons in the early 1900s. So what is happening with Venezuela in the early 1900s? They're an independent country that we've talked about before. Around the year 1900, the country is run by a military general named Cipriano Castro. So he really ran a Venezuelan dictatorship and was having all kinds of economic problems. There's what we today call recession going on in Venezuela, so there's an economic downturn. The government is borrowing lots of money to pay its bills, so there are yearly deficits. And there are nearly constant regional uprisings against the central government throughout Venezuela during his tenure. So his solution to a lot of these economic problems was to basically blame foreign banks and foreign loans, that the government had taken on loans from foreign banks to pay its bills, and his strategy was to basically blame those banks for taking advantage of Venezuela and to really just stop making those debt payments on a monthly basis to the European creditors, the European bankers, starting around 1902. And that angered those European bankers so much that they called up their government leaders in Europe and demanded that the European governments do something about this. And the Europeans did. They sent a series of warships from Britain, Germany, and Italy, all combined in the early 1900s, in 1902, to surround the Venezuelan coastline to stop new ships from coming in, and even to launch attacks against the Venezuelan coastline, to launch bombardment. So they shot cannon fire onto the coastline to intimidate the Venezuelan government and really economically strangle Venezuela to the point where they can force the government to restart those payments to the European banks. So we see a very close collaboration between European governments that just 10 years later, 12 years later, will be at war with each other. Britain, Germany, and Italy will fight World War I against each other, but at this moment they all agree to collaborate in trying to force Venezuela to start making those debt payments again. So that economic and military pressure forced the Venezuelan government to basically ask the United States for help. And the United States was more than happy to help because the United States is very worried about the Europeans looking for excuses to recolonize parts of the Americas. So the Venezuelan leader Castro directly appealed to Washington, D.C., and specifically President Roosevelt for help with this problem. And eventually they negotiate what comes to be known as the Washington Protocol of 1903, where it was really a U.S. promise to help the Venezuelan government collect its taxes, largely tariffs, taxes on imports coming into the country. And in exchange, the deal said that 30% of those taxes on imports, that money that the Venezuelan government made, would go directly to the European banks to pay off those loans. So the Venezuelan government was happy that the European warships then left and they got their economy opened back up. But the Venezuelan people, by and large, are not very happy that 30% of their kind of daily tax revenue is going directly to foreign lenders. So that money is not even staying in Venezuela, it's going to other places. But this situation in 1902, 1903 worried the U.S. government, and specifically Roosevelt, so much that they started a series of new announcements that came to be known as the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is Roosevelt's statement that the United States feels that it is kind of responsible for keeping stability throughout Latin America. So it's not just talking about Venezuela. Roosevelt said that the United States has what he called a civilizing power as the leader of the Americas and the first of the countries in the Americas to have, gone into revolution against a European tyrant and created a new source of freedom in the Americas, these new countries. So Roosevelt says that the United States at this point is the most wealthy and powerful of those countries in the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. So that's what gives them the civilizing power. They have the wealth and the military and the scientific technological power to lead the rest of the Americas into stability and independence, and to basically make sure that the promise of the Americas would be fulfilled. So the corollary talks about that the United States will help stabilize Latin America, will help guarantee that Latin American countries can pay their debts, that they keep kind of basic law and order in their country, and that they try to avoid kind of incompetence or wrongdoing or general corruption in the country. So that's kind of a grand statement from Roosevelt that the United States is going to help Latin American governments achieve this stuff. But it's not just out of kind of pure desire to help their fellow man or anything like that. The United States is going to try to get something very specific out of this. So, number one, the United States is demanding that Latin American governments make their monthly debt payments, what a lot of the textbooks call their monthly obligations. But it's basically paying their monthly bills to European creditors, European bankers, bankers from the United States, really anyone who had loaned those Latin American governments money. And the idea is that if these Latin American governments can pay those bills, then the bankers won't get so upset anymore and do a repeat of what happened in Venezuela, where they send in the European militaries to force payment. And in exchange, the corollary also says that European governments are not supposed to intervene in the Americas. So it's very similar to the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States accepts the fact that Europeans still have some colonies in the Americas, but that the Europeans are not supposed to try to come back and reestablish or reconquer colonies or rebuild colonies in the Americas. Basically saying that the Americas are not a zone for European conquest anymore. And the United States says that the U.S. government is willing to help these Latin American countries make their debt payments, not by direct payments from the U.S. government so much, but more through U.S. banks going in and taking over Latin American national debts when those countries just cannot make the payments anymore, when they're just overburdened with debt that is just impossible for them. So whenever those Latin American governments, their debts get too big and it looks like the government's going under, the corollary basically says that U.S. banks should go in and take over those debts in order to make sure that the payments happen, especially to the European banks, the creditors, so that the Europeans will never get so pissed off again that they'll again send in their militaries and do something that the United States doesn't want. So basically U.S. banks will kind of take over a lot of Latin American government financial systems whenever they're in distress. And the U.S. government promises to, quote, assist U.S. banks in collecting tax revenue to make those payments. So what that term assist actually means is kind of vague, and intentionally vague. Nobody really knows if this means that the U.S. government is just going to strongly ask people to pay their taxes, or if like the U.S. government's going to get angry and send in the U.S. military to take over a country to make sure that those payments get made. So that's left very vague, very kind of nebulous. Nobody really knows exactly what those terms mean. So it's really up to future U.S. leaders to interpret this stuff however they want. But remember, this is not actual U.S. law. This is just something that the President of the United States is saying that this is now U.S. foreign policy. This is how the White House is going to act in its relations with Latin American countries and European countries. So the goal is really pretty obvious for the corollary. Roosevelt's goal is to really stop the possibility of Europeans using a Latin American financial crisis as an excuse to send in their militaries and reconquer or rebuild colonies in the Americas. So it's really to stop the Europeans from getting a foothold in the Americas again. It's really a foreign policy to guarantee that Latin America is open to more U.S. dominance or U.S. control for the long term, and to keep the Europeans out. So the U.S. goal is to really take over the debts that are owed to European banks so that the Europeans never really have a beef enough with Latin American governments to send in their militaries. Just stop the motivation for Europeans to do that and you'll stop the result. Venezuela continues to have problems even after the corollary. In the early 1900s, the dictator Castro tried to get more foreign help to pay off some of these European debts by actually selling off some pretty lucrative mining contracts in Venezuela, even without kind of legal congressional permission to do so. So when that got out in the news, and then some investigations revealed that he was also selling off some lucrative contracts and keeping some of the money for himself and enriching his family, that angered the population so much that the rest of the government basically overthrew him, kicked him out of office in 1908 when all these news stories started to go public. So right in 1908, Roosevelt would have been up for re-election in the United States. He served basically 2 full terms as president, so he followed a kind of long-standing tradition to basically retire after 2 terms. So he picks his own kind of Republican Party friend to run for office in his place, and that guy got elected in 1908 and was inaugurated in 1909, and his name is William Taft. So Taft is very much a kind of mini Roosevelt, basically. Follows most of Roosevelt's general policies, including the idea of using money to try to control foreign governments. Taft will call this dollar diplomacy. So that's the big phrase that goes into U.S. textbooks. But it's really about the same thing. The Taft administration wants to continue to try to dominate Latin America and expand U.S. influence over Latin America wherever possible. But Taft doesn't want to use troops to do that, because using the U.S. Army to conquer Cuba and kind of colonize Cuba and the Philippines and some other areas from that they gained from the war with Spain caused a lot of public backlash in the United States, and really ran strongly against U.S. traditions and history of really staying neutral and staying out of especially European wars. And also there was a long-standing kind of taboo in U.S. politics against keeping what we call standing armies. Generally, the U.S. population was very opposed to keeping large peacetime armies. Throughout U.S. history to that point, the U.S. military was kept very, very small, only a couple, 20,000 troops or so, and the U.S. military only expands when the United States goes to war. So it was very strange for the U.S. military to get built up when there is no war. That's why we call them peacetime armies. So Taft was aware of that. And Taft wanted to avoid using soldiers to control foreign countries, so he hits on the idea of kind of using this corollary statement that Roosevelt had made and kind of expand on that idea and instead use money instead of troops or bullets or anything like that. So the phrase he used is dollar diplomacy, and he literally said the goal is to substitute dollars for bullets. Use money to influence foreign governments instead of military threats. So Taft's idea is that sending in U.S. banks and U.S. companies into Latin American countries especially would stabilize their economies. Those companies would buy lands and build factories and hire local workers, so there would be good amount of prosperity in those countries, which would create stable democracies, or so they hoped, and would also generate profits for U.S. businesses. So Taft sees this as a win-win. It creates stable democracies, or even if they're not really interested in democracy, at least create political stability of some kind, so that the U.S. will have friendly governments throughout Latin America to work with, and it will also create good business investment opportunities for U.S. companies. So Taft says it does good, and it creates profits, and it's all nonviolent, so everything's it's a kind of perfect idea to him. Remember, Taft and Roosevelt, they were in the Republican Party, so of course Democrats attacked these ideas and basically said that it's an excuse to use the U.S. government to create investment opportunities to enrich corporate America, the biggest companies in the United States. And Democrats also basically argued that in Taft's years in office, this policy generally fails. Taft tried to use it among different countries in Latin America. Mostly didn't work, and in some countries Taft would have to send in the military anyway. So Democrats often said that this is a pie in the sky idea that doesn't work in the real world. And we'll kind of move on and talk about some of these instances and places where it was attempted and just did not work. The Dominican Republic is on one of the bigger islands, if I can get my pointer. Dominican Republic, again, is the eastern kind of 2/3 of Hispaniola. So one of the bigger islands in the Caribbean. So it shares that island with Haiti. So the Dominican Republic by 1905 had run up huge national debts, especially to European and U.S. bankers. And the Europeans, once again, were threatening to send in warships to surround the Dominican Republic and basically force payment. So around that time, 1905, the United States took over tax collection basically in the Dominican Republic, especially taxes on imports. And the U.S. government basically ran that tax collection and used much of it to just pay off the European bankers. And the United States hoped that that would solve the crisis in 1905, and it seemed to do fairly well for a while. But in 1916, the United States government sent in troops and basically occupied the entire country, the Dominican Republic, with thousands of U.S. soldiers, and would keep those soldiers in place for 8 years until 1924. So the U.S. is basically militarily occupying the Dominican Republic and running the government at that point. And we'll talk later about how the United States government was also occupying Haiti militarily in 1915 through the 1930s. So the U.S. military is, through 1924, is militarily occupying virtually the whole island, both governments, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So there's thousands and thousands of U.S. soldiers on that island. The U.S. occupation would build a whole lot of infrastructure, public infrastructure like roads and schools and whatnot in the Dominican Republic through the occupation that ended in 1924. But most Dominicans, most people living in the country, were very opposed to the occupation and hated it and wanted it to be over as soon as possible. So that's one instance where the United States tried to use its economic influence, some form of economic warfare, to control the Dominican government, and it just didn't work after about 10 years, and they had to send in the troops and completely overthrow the government. We'll see similar attempts at using economic control in Nicaragua after 1910. So remember, going back into the 1800s, the U.S. foreign policy in Central America was to get a canal built somewhere. And really the U.S. Location for a canal, their best choice, was in the southern border of Nicaragua. And so some U.S. surveyors went into that area and were kind of looking around, poking around, looking at how they could strategically build a canal in the late 1800s. But the Nicaraguan dictator, Jose Santos Zelaya, was completely resistant to allowing the U.S. any attempt to control or build a canal or have any control over the Nicaraguan government. So he was in office until 1910, when the United States finally got sick of the guy and took the extreme step of supporting a revolt against his government, the Zelayan government. So they supported basically a revolution against the Nicaraguan government and forced the dictator to resign and to replace him with someone that's more friendly to U.S. demands. European bankers had also loaned the Nicaraguan government quite a lot of money, so they very much panicked when the U.S. basically helped overthrow the government. And the Europeans in 1910 start demanding immediate debt repayments, which pushed the new leadership of Nicaragua, basically hand-chosen by the United States, to ask the United States to help defend U.S. economic interest in Nicaragua against a possible European invasion. So in 1910, President Taft sent in the U.S. Marines into Nicaragua to defend the country against a possible European invasion, and also sent bankers from New York City into Nicaragua to strike a deal to figure out how to pay down those debts that the Nicaraguan government owed to European creditors. And the deal is basically that U.S. bankers will get the power to run Nicaraguan tax collection and debt payments in exchange for the U.S. basically U.S. companies taking over the Nicaraguan National Bank and most of the Nicaraguan railroad systems. And in doing so, the U.S. owns all the, or U.S. companies own all the major economic investments and industrial systems in Nicaragua. in the 19 teens, which basically means that the United States economically controls the country and therefore controls the country's government. So this is hardcore, hardball economic warfare that the United States is running against Nicaragua, as it had run against the Dominicans and Venezuelans and others. So we see this building up as a kind of theory of how the United States is going to run its foreign policy, really again using money to try to control Latin American governments wherever it thought useful. So the United States government declares Nicaragua to be a, quote, protectorate of the United States that will go on until 1933. And that protectorate ends in 33 when national elections elect in 32 a fairly liberal politician named Juan Bautista Sacasa to become president of Nicaragua. And he goes into office, and as president, he starts to demand that the United States withdraws troops from Nicaragua and that Nicaragua basically be allowed to run its own affairs again. So this is a couple decades after the first kind of incursions in 1910. So the U.S. banks had already profited off of their control over Nicaragua for 20 years, so they're ready to get out also. And the new U.S. president, Franklin Roosevelt, is also being inaugurated in March 1933, and he wants to kind of revamp U.S. foreign relations with Latin America. He wants to be more friendly with Latin American countries, or so he says. So he's looking to kind of reboot U.S. relationships with places like Nicaragua. So he basically agrees to end the U.S. occupation. But right around this time in the early 1930s, there's also a kind of local guerrilla movement, a revolt, a military revolt that breaks out against the Nicaraguan government. The big leader of this revolt is named Augusto Cesar Sandino. And basically the Sandino forces largely attacked the Nicaraguan National Guard, which at the time is led by this guy Anastasio Somoza Garcia. So those are the two big military personalities in Nicaragua that are fighting it out. So Sandino accuses the Nicaraguan government of being controlled by the Americans still, the United States, and that's what Sandino and his forces are really rebelling against. They want Nicaraguans to basically run Nicaragua for their own internal development and their own benefit of their own people. And Sandino accuses a lot of Nicaraguan politicians, others, and Somoza Garcia for basically collaborating with the United States, basically being U.S. puppets. They take orders from the United States and run Nicaragua for the benefit of the United States. So Sandino and his followers are very angry about that, and that's where their guerrilla movement comes from. So they're largely attacking the Nicaraguan National Guard, which is basically their national military. Until Sacasa invited Sandino to a meeting to try to stop the guerrilla movement, stop the attacks. So President Sacasa openly negotiated with Sandino at a private meeting. But when Sandino left the meeting, Somoza Garcia had him arrested and quickly executed. So Sandino is out. So that is Somoza Garcia's attempt to destroy the guerrilla movement. And quickly after having Sandino killed, the National Guard under Somoza Garcia then basically took over the country and pushed the sitting president, Sacasa, out of the country and established a dictatorship under himself. So it becomes known as the Somoza government, which was very tyrannical, run basically for the benefit of the big landowning families in Nicaragua, And the Somoza family became one of the richest because they were the political leaders, so they made a lot of deals and a lot of embezzlement that benefited their family personally. So Somoza built up a giant fortune for his family. He made strong alliances with other big landowning families in Nicaragua. He did promote a lot of industrialization policies and national economic growth policies that were fairly successful. But again, he was extremely repressive, and especially against any communists that might have been in Nicaragua by the 1930s. So we'll talk about the importance of communism later on as we get toward the Cold War. But there's a lot of Marxists and communists around Latin America, and the United States is very worried about that. So Somoza keeps a very close relationship with the United States throughout his reign until '56. And he basically promises to destroy any communist groups in Nicaragua in order to cement and solidify that close relationship with the United States. Because that's what the United States wants in Latin America. It wants to destroy communists because it's afraid of communist revolution. So Somoza is in office until 1956 when he's actually assassinated. And his two sons will basically take turns running the Nicaraguan government into the 1970s. So the Somoza dictatorship lasts quite a long time, is completely repressive, and most of the Nicaraguan people come to hate it in one way or another over time. And the last section we're going to talk about today is how after World War I, the United States would start to use this type of economic warfare to control or influence other parts of the world, not just Latin America. So the United States sees its economic warfare policies as fairly successful from the early 1900s and will look to kind of expand those policies to a worldwide scope in order to basically dominate the world with money. And the United States is able to do that because World War I ended in 1918, 1919. And World War I was massively destructive, particularly in Europe where it was mostly fought. And it was so destructive that it pretty much annihilated the economies of the main U.S. competitors, places like Germany, Britain, France, Russia. They were the big economies that were competing with the United States on a worldwide scope. So the United States largely stays out of the war for the most of it. The United States doesn't get involved in World War I until the last year, and barely sends hardly any troops. Only 100,000 U.S. soldiers go to Europe or so, whereas each of the main fighters had 4 or 5 million soldiers fighting during World War I. So the United States sends relatively few troops to fight in World War I and suffers very little damage, virtually no damage in the United States itself as a result of fighting the war, whereas again the economies and a lot of the young men of Europe had been killed off in the war. So during the war, the United States became the world's biggest economy. It had been on that path for probably 30 years since it launched into full-scale industrialization in the late 1800s. But the United States became the dominant economic power of the world during World War I because its main competitors were all busy destroying each other. And Britain and France in particular took on massive debts to U.S.-based companies to keep getting war supplies and other supplies from U.S. factories to be shipped across the ocean to get to Britain and France so that they can continue fighting the war. So Britain and France owed massive debts to U.S. companies when the war ended. And they needed to find a way to get enough money together to make those monthly payments, and also to finance rebuilding their own economies after the war. So the idea they hit on was to force Germany in the treaty that ended the war, force treaty to accept guilt for having started the war in the first place. So the treaty says it basically is all Germany's fault, and so Germany should have to pay big monthly payments, especially to Britain and France and other countries that suffered massive damage that were called basically reparation payments. And that does several things. Number one, it makes Britain and France totally economically dependent on Germany making those monthly payments after the war through the 1920s and 30s. And when Germany has trouble making those payments, U.S. banks will loan money to the German government to make those payments. So it's, again, the U.S. government figuring out how to use its wealth, its economic and industrial power, to control European governments at this point. And another result of this kind of system of merry-go-round of money, basically, is that the German economy is destroyed. And it cannot recover because any money that gets into Germany is immediately going out the back door toward Britain and France on a monthly basis. So the German economy never really recovers from the war in the 1920s. And German voters are so angry about that, and angry that their political leaders have made those deals, that they start voting for kind of radical alternative parties and politicians who make big promises that basically elect me, put me in power, and I'll fix the economic mess and make Germany a great country again. And that's what really puts Germany on the path toward putting Hitler in power in the 1930s. So World War I's economic consequences for Germany, Britain, France, the United States have massive future results that will directly lead Europe and the United States toward World War II in the 1940s. But again, the thing to really emphasize right now in this lecture is to understand how the United States is using its dominant economic position in the world to influence, push around foreign governments, even some of the formerly most powerful governments in the world like Germany, France, Britain, even at the same time that they are trying to use their dominant economy to control and influence Latin American governments in the same years. And this really comes to a head in the 1920s, especially under a new administration, under President Warren Harding and his Secretary of State, Hughes. So their foreign policy goals are pretty clear, and they talk about them pretty much constantly. This administration is elected in 1920, goes into office in 1921, and has some pretty clear economic goals. Number one, they want the economic open door, which basically means that all countries in the world should open their countries to foreign trade, so that any business from any country in the world should be able to access any other country in the world, so that they can buy things and sell things and move goods around and all this stuff without really being inhibited. So that's what the open door means. And of course, the United States wants the economic open door because U.S. leaders believe that their businesses are better and more efficient and more profitable than any of their competitors around the world. So if the whole world is open to international business, then the United States businesses are most likely, at this point in the early 1920s, to dominate the world economy. So you get all these quotes from people like Harding saying commerce is the lifeblood of civilization, or the business of America is business. I mean, all these kinds of things, really to emphasize just open trade amongst countries. Of course, in order to dominate the world economy, the United States wants to have the strongest navy in the world, or at least one of the strongest navies in the world, to enforce what we would think of as international law, or enforce the open door, or any other policies that could benefit the United States over its competitors. And another major thing that Harding and his administration wanted is to avoid foreign entanglements, which basically means avoid military treaties, because most observers thought that those kind of alliances were what had caused World War I in the first place. So the United States does not want to sign any kind of military alliances with most of the rest of the world. The United States wants to keep its military small and basically run the world through investment and money. And they even convene a major military conference in Washington that becomes known as the Washington Naval Conference, and that goes from late 1921 into 1922, the first few months of the new year. And the U.S. demands at this conference are pretty clear. The United States wants to hold a dominant military power in the world. And one thing to remember about the 1920s, airplanes are around. They've been around for 15 years by this point. But they're not powerful enough to usually sail across the entire ocean. And if they're even able to do that, they're basically on a skeleton crew. So they can't carry giant cargoes across the ocean. So when you're talking about international business, all those goods are still being transported on boats. Therefore, whoever has the biggest navy in the world has the most international military influence. And the Washington Naval Conference is designed by Harding and his administration to basically demand that the rest of the world, the major powers, adhere to very strict limits on the size of the navy that they're going to be allowed to have. So on this slide we see a breakdown. The United States and Britain are going to be allowed under this proposal to have the two biggest navies in the world, and they'll be equal. And Japan, the next biggest power, is going to be allowed to have 60% of the size of the U.S. or British navies. So still big and powerful, but still the U.S. or Britain will be able to push around the Japanese military basically at will. And France and Italy, the other two big powers that helped the United States and Britain win World War I, they're allowed to have 35% of the size of the biggest navies. So these are the U.S. demands, and they're going to look to enforce them. Another demand is to make the economic open door the cornerstone of international law. So basically force all the other countries, major countries in the world, to accept this open door idea. So it's the power of any potential competitor. The treaty that ended World War I forced Germany to keep only a very tiny navy. So this would put the United States in the position to be the dominant military and economic power into the far future. And they're playing economic hardball. So a third demand is Secretary of State Hughes got up on one of the first days of the conference and gave a speech that included the line that all preparations for offensive war will stop now. And this is not a request. This is a demand. This is basically the U.S. government telling all the other major world powers, stop building up your military. The United States will not allow a future arms race. That is over. The arms races had helped cause World War I, and the United States wants to demobilize most of the major world militaries to avoid a future war, and also to guarantee that no other military will rise up and become powerful enough to threaten U.S. dominance. So he basically tells the other world leaders, you're going to abide by these limits, and you're not going to overbuild your military beyond that. And whenever you make those kind of statements, whenever you're telling someone what to do, that has to be joined with a threat. And the threat that the U.S. government gave was very clear. The United States basically said to the other world powers at this meeting that if they start to build their armies or their navies beyond their permitted size that the United States is telling them that they're allowed to have, then the United States will destroy the national economy of any government that tries to go beyond their set limits. So the U.S. government said basically U.S. businesses and banks are giving loans to governments, they're giving loans to private companies in your country. U.S. businesses are building factories or investing in your country. And if your government decides to build beyond its limits that the U.S. has laid out for you, then the U.S. government will order all of its businesses to leave your country and watch your economy collapse. Watch unemployment skyrocket. So this is real hardcore economic warfare. And remember, a lot of these governments also owed the United States from the debts they incurred during World War I. So the United States government also said, we might just call back all of your war debts and destroy your economy that way, if you don't follow these rules that we're telling you at this conference. And even if somehow your economy survives this economic warfare that we will bring against you if you go against our demands, then guess what? The United States government has more revenue than your government anyway. So even if you want to rebuild your military beyond the limits that we're laying out for you, the United States has more money anyway. The United States will just outbuild. The United States government will just build an even bigger military than you're even capable of. And then we'll see what happens in the future. So, this is hardcore economic warfare. This is hardball. Do what we want or we will destroy you one way or the other. And the U.S. meant it. So, the United States through the 1920s will continue using these kinds of economic threats to keep the Europeans making their debt payments from the war, to also at the same time allow the United States to formally stay out of any military alliances with any European countries. So again, the United States is using its economic clout, its economic power, money, to basically run the world. And that works for a while, more or less. There's some stability. There's a lot of stability in Europe, but there's also some instability in places like Germany and whatnot that the U.S. Bankers and economic threats are never able to solve. And we know where that eventually goes by the 1930s. Hitler gets into power. But this threat of economic warfare was pretty effective in the 1920s, but will suddenly disappear when the U.S. stock market crashes in late 1929, which is one of the first steps that gets the Great Depression going. And once that happens, U.S. government revenue really collapses, and along with the rest of the U.S. economy. And that destroys the U.S. government's ability to try to run the world with economic threats, because they don't have an economic threat anymore. The U.S. economy is in free fall. So in the 1930s, not only are U.S. leaders much less able to use the threat of economic power, economic warfare to keep other countries in line, U.S. leaders in the 1930s are going to become much more interested in trying to solve the Depression in the United States and get employment going again and trying to restabilize the economy. So at the end of the 1920s, U.S. economic power basically disappears suddenly. And the whole world gets kind of sucked into this Great Depression by 1932-33. So it becomes a worldwide problem for the most part. There's only a few countries that largely avoid it. But we'll talk later about how the Great Depression of the 1930s has a major impact on the policies and the political stances that Latin American leaders will take from the 1930s into the 1940s. So there'll be a giant rise in Latin American populism and nationalism that we'll talk about in a future lecture. So we'll stop here for today.